Wyatt Earp faced down outlaws and killers. But when the moon turns full over redemption, he'll confront a terror legends never prepared him for, a nightmare in teeth and claws that bleeds silver. The dust of redemption, Arizona, clung to everything like a second skin. A fine, gritty powder that coated the boardwalks, settled on the brims of hats, and found its way into the lines etched around Wyatt Earp's keen blue eyes. He stood by the window of the marshal's office, a tall, imposing figure even in repose, watching the late afternoon sun bleed orange and purple across the hard-packed dirt of Main Street. Redemption wasn't the worst town he'd pinned a star on for, nor was it the best. It was, like most frontier settlements, a place of harsh realities and fleeting dreams, a precarious balance between raw ambition and the ever-present threat of chaos. Wyatt sipped lukewarm coffee from a tin mug, the bitterness a familiar companion. The day had been quiet, almost unnervingly so. A drunken brawl at the Red Garter Saloon had been quelled with a stern word and a steely gaze. A suspected horse thief had turned out to be merely forgetful, and the stagecoach had arrived on time, disgorging a nervous-looking preacher and a woman whose painted smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Standard fare for a Tuesday. The jingle of spurs announced Doc Holliday before he appeared. A wisp of a man wrapped in a surprisingly fine coat, his face pale except for the feverish flush on his cheeks. He leaned against the doorframe, a thin cheroot smouldering between his fingers, and offered a wry grin. Contemplating the sins of the world, Wyatt, or just wondering if the widow Abernathy will ever learn to bake a decent pie? Wyatt allowed himself a faint smile. Neither, Doc. Just enjoying the quiet while it lasts. Doc coughed, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to shake his slender frame. Quiet's a fickle mistress in towns like these. She usually has a rowdy cousin named Trouble, waiting just around the corner. He took a drag of his cheroot, the tip glowing like a malevolent firefly. Heard tell old Jedediah Stone struck a decent vein up in the Dragoon foothills. Might be he'll come to town flashing silver, looking for a good time and an early grave. No, let's hope he's sensible enough to bank it first, Wyatt replied, his gaze still fixed on the street as the last of the townsfolk hurried to their homes, lamplight beginning to spill from windows. The air was cooling rapidly, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the distant mournful cry of a coyote. As twilight deepened into a star-pricked indigo, a different sound began to thread its way through the usual night noises of redemption. It started low, a mournful ululation that seemed to rise from the earth itself, carrying on the freshening breeze that swept down from the mountains. Dogs, usually quick to bark at any disturbance, fell silent, whining uneasily in their yards. Men paused in their conversations at the saloon, heads cocked, a flicker of primal unease in their eyes. Wyatt felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. It wasn't a coyote. Not quite. There was a depth to it, a resonance that spoke of something larger, something unfamiliar. Odd, Doc murmured, his usual cynicism tinged with a note of genuine curiosity. He pushed himself off the doorframe. Well, the night is young, and the cards are calling my name. Try not to let the boogeyman get you, Marshal. He tipped his hat and sauntered off towards the beckoning lights of the Red Garter, his cough echoing softly in the growing darkness. Wyatt remained by the window long after Doc had gone, the strange howl periodically rising and falling, each cry seeming to draw closer, then recede, a phantom lament on the edge of hearing. He finally turned from the window, the unease settling in his gut like undigested food. He checked the loads in his Colt Peacemaker by feel, the metallic click of the cylinder, a small reassuring sound in the quiet office. He told himself it was just the wind, or a wolf pack grown bold, but a deeper instinct, honed by years of facing down danger, whispered otherwise. Miles away, nestled in a shallow canyon in the Dragoon foothills, Silas Stoney McGee, a grizzled prospector with more hope than gold dust in his pouches, hunched over a meager campfire. His mule, Bess, snorted nervously nearby, ears swiveling. Stoney had heard the howls too, and they'd put him on edge. He'd been prospecting these hills for 20 years, and had heard every sound the wilderness could conjure, but this was different. It felt personal somehow. He'd found promising color earlier that day, a thin seam of quartz glittering with what looked suspiciously like silver. Not Jedediah Stone's strike, but enough to make him dream of a warm bath, a steak, and maybe even a new hat. He'd decided to camp one more night, hoping to trace the vein further at first light. The fire crackled, spitting sparks into the inky blackness. Bess suddenly let out a terrified bray, yanking at her tether, her eyes wide and white in the firelight. "Easy, girl, easy now," Stoney mumbled, reaching for his old shotgun. He peered into the darkness beyond the fire's small circle of light. The wind rustled the dry leaves of the scrub oak, creating shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Then he heard it, a heavy tread in the loose screen nearby, the snap of a twig too thick for any coyote or javelina. It was big, whatever it was, and close. Stoney raised his shotgun, his heart hammering against his ribs. His lantern, hanging from a low branch, cast a feeble, flickering glow. He licked his dry lips. "Who's out there? Show yourself!" Only the whisper of the wind answered, carrying with it a faint, musky odor he couldn't quite place. Then, from the edge of the lantern light, 2 points of luminescence resolved themselves into eyes. They were large, set wide apart, and glowed with a chilling yellowish-green intensity. They weren't animal eyes, not entirely. There was a dreadful, calculating intelligence in their depths. Bess screamed, a raw, panicked sound, and lunged so hard against her rope that the knot gave way. She galloped wildly into the darkness, her hooves thudding away into silence. Stoney was alone. He swallowed hard, the shotgun feeling suddenly inadequate. The glowing eyes moved, and a massive dark shape began to detach itself from the deeper shadows. It was low to the ground, powerful, and moved with a horrifying fluid grace. "Lord have mercy!" Stoney breathed, his finger tightening on the trigger. The lantern swung gently in the breeze, its light catching a glint of something long and sharp as the shape rose, unfolding to an impossible height. Before Stoney could even scream, before he could truly comprehend the monstrous form silhouetted against the faint starlight, the darkness lunged, and the world dissolved into a cacophony of tearing sounds and a single, abruptly silenced cry that the wind snatched away, leaving only the crackling fire and the whispering leaves to bear witness. The first hint of trouble, beyond the unsettling howls that had disturbed Redemption's slumber, arrived not with a bang, but with the frantic riderless clatter of hooves. Stoney McGee's mule, Bess, galloped into town just as the eastern sky was beginning to pale from inky black to a bruised purple. Her eyes were wild, flecked with foam, and a length of frayed rope still dangled from her halter. She made a beeline for the livery stable, her sides heaving, and nearly bowled over young Timmy Evans, the stable boy, who was just starting his morning chores. News travelled fast in a town the size of Redemption. By the time Wyatt Earp had strapped on his gun belt and headed for the livery, a small knot of concerned townsfolk had already gathered. He pushed through them, his expression grim. Bess was still trembling, her coat matted with sweat and burrs. "She came in alone, Marshal," Timmy stammered, his voice tight with fear. "Looks like she's run hard all night. That's Stony McGee's mule, ain't it?" Wyatt ran a hand along Bess's neck, calming her slightly. "It is. Stony was prospecting up in the Dragoons. Said he'd be back by yesterday evening at the latest." He looked at the frayed rope. It hadn't been cut. It had been snapped, as if by a sudden violent force. A cold knot tightened in his stomach, recalling the unnerving howls from the night before. "Get a couple of men, Timmy," Wyatt said, his voice low and steady. "We'll ride out at first light, see if we can find him." He glanced at the faces in the small crowd, faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Probably just got himself turned around, or Bess spooked at a coyote. He offered the explanation, but his own gut wasn't buying it. Within the hour, as the sun crested the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and rose, Wyatt led a small posse of 3 men out of Redemption. Deputy Hank Ketchum, a young man eager to prove himself, but whose face was currently a shade paler than usual, rode beside him. 2 older, more seasoned townsmen, Jebediah Smith and Tom Olson, both familiar with the foothills, brought up the rear. The trail was easy enough to follow at first. Bess's panicked flight had left clear tracks. They led them steadily upwards into the rugged terrain where Stony often searched for his elusive fortune. The morning air was crisp and clean, catching the scent of pine and damp earth. But Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding that had settled over him. The howls from the previous night echoed in his memory, more menacing in retrospect. After nearly 2 hours of riding, Jebediah, whose eyes were as sharp as any hawk's, reined in his horse. "Marshal, look there! Smoke!" Wyatt followed his pointing finger. A thin tendril of grey smoke curled lazily into the blue sky from a shallow canyon just ahead. Stony's campsite. A wave of relief, however small, washed over him. Maybe the old prospector had simply overslept, or had a minor accident. They approached cautiously, Wyatt in the lead. The campsite came into view. A still smouldering fire, a scattered bedroll, a coffee pot tipped on its side. But no Stony. "Stony, you in there, old man?" Wyatt called out, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet canyon. Only silence answered, broken by the buzzing of flies that seemed to gather with an unnatural swiftness. The musky odour he'd faintly detected on the wind last night was stronger here, mixed with something else, something coppery and foul that made his stomach churn. Deputy Ketchum dismounted, his hand instinctively going to the butt of his pistol. "Marshal, I don't like this." Wyatt swung down from his horse, his eyes scanning every detail of the disordered camp. He saw the overturned lantern, its glass shattered. He saw the deep gouges in the earth near the fire, as if something heavy had been dragged. And then he saw the shotgun, lying near a scrub oak, its stock splintered. One barrel had been fired. The flies were thickest near a dense patch of manzanita bushes a little way from the campfire. Wyatt pushed aside the stiff, leathery leaves. his breath catching in his throat. What was left of Stony McGee lay sprawled in the dirt. Wyatt had seen death in many forms. Gunshot wounds, knife attacks, the aftermath of barroom brawls gone too far. But this was different. He signalled for the others to stay back, a gesture they readily obeyed, their faces ashen. Stony had been torn apart, savaged with a ferocity that defied comprehension. The wounds were not the work of a mountain lion or a bear. They were too extensive, too deliberate. Large, ragged chunks of flesh had been ripped away, and strange, deep claw marks raked across what remained of his torso and limbs. Wyatt knelt, forcing himself to examine the scene, his mind struggling to process the sheer brutality. He saw tracks in the disturbed earth around the body, massive, elongated prints with clear impressions of long, sharp claws. They were not wolf prints, nor bear. They were something else, something that walked on two legs at times, yet possessed the savagery of a dozen enraged beasts. He rose slowly, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Hank, ride back to town. Tell Doc Holliday to meet me at his office, and tell him it's bad, worse than anything I've seen." Hank, visibly shaken, nodded mutely and scrambled onto his horse, eager to escape the horror of the canyon. Jebediah and Tom approached, their faces pale. "What in God's name could do that, Marshal?" Tom whispered, his voice hoarse. Wyatt shook his head, his gaze sweeping the surrounding rocks and brush, a new, chilling awareness dawning. "I don't know, Tom, but whatever it was, it's not like any animal I've ever encountered." He looked back at the gruesome scene. "And I don't think it's human either." Whispers began to circulate as soon as Hank Ketchum, pale and stammering, relayed the horrifying news in hushed tones at the Red Garter, then to anyone who would listen on Main Street. Stony McGee, torn to pieces. An animal, they said, but like no animal seen before. Tracks bigger than a grizzly's. The whispers slithered through Redemption, coiling around the townsfolk, tightening their grip. Fear, cold and sharp, began to take root in the heart of the town, nurtured by the unknown horror that lurked just beyond the familiar boundaries of their world. Wyatt, standing over the grim remains in that silent canyon, knew this was only the beginning. The howls from the night before had not just been a sound, they had been a promise. The sun climbed higher, beating down on Redemption with an unforgiving intensity. Yet a chill seemed to have settled over the town that no amount of desert heat could dispel. Wyatt Earp rode back into Main Street late that morning, his face set in grim lines. The bodies of Stony McGee and, a few hours later, his similarly savaged mule Bess, carefully wrapped in tarps and carried on a makeshift travois by Jebediah and Tom. The sight, even obscured, sent a fresh wave of horrified murmurs through the onlookers who had gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and stark fear. Doc Holliday was waiting at the marshal's office, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses already on the small, cluttered desk. His usual sardonic demeanour was muted, his eyes sharp and questioning, as Wyatt entered, dust-covered and weary. "Hank painted a rather vivid picture," Doc said quietly, pouring a generous measure of amber liquid into each glass. "Said you'd never seen anything like it." Wyatt took the offered glass and downed half of it in one gulp, the fiery spirit doing little to burn away the cold knot in his stomach. He wasn't exaggerating. He described the scene at the campsite, the unnatural savagery, the sheer destructive force, and most disturbingly, the tracks. They were huge, Doc, clawed, but the stride. At times it looked like it was walking on 2 legs, other times 4. And the way Stoney was, it wasn't just killing for food. It was rage, pure, unadulterated rage. Doc swirled the whiskey in his glass, his gaze distant. The howls last night. You heard them too. It wasn't a question. Wyatt nodded. They weren't normal. The rest of the day was a blur of grim duty, arranging for Stoney's burial, trying to reassure the increasingly agitated townsfolk, fielding questions he had no answers to. He posted extra men on watch for the night, though he knew deep down that if whatever did this decided to visit Redemption, a few extra shotguns wouldn't make much difference. The consensus among the more practical-minded was a rogue grizzly, perhaps driven mad by injury or hunger, or a pack of unusually vicious wolves. But Wyatt had seen grizzly kills and wolf kills. This was neither. This was something that felt ancient, primal, and terrifyingly intelligent. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to twist familiar shapes into monstrous forms, a new kind of terror struck. A piercing scream ripped through the evening air, coming from the poorer collection of shanties at the western edge of town, near the creek. Wyatt was out of his office in an instant, his Colt already in his hand, his heart pounding. He ran towards the sound, followed by a growing number of men, their faces pale in the fading light. They found Martha Henderson, a widow with 3 young children, collapsed on the dirt path outside her small cabin, hysterical. "My Rosie!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger towards the open doorway of her home. She was just playing by the stoop. I turned my back for a minute, just a minute, and she was gone. Something took her. I heard it. A growl, so deep. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Wyatt. A child. He pushed past the distraught mother into the dimly lit cabin. 2 younger children cowered in a corner, their eyes wide with terror. The room was small, sparsely furnished. The back door, a flimsy wooden affair, hung crookedly on one hinge, splintered around the latch, as if something immensely powerful had simply shouldered its way through. Wyatt moved to the doorway, his gaze sweeping the dusty ground outside. And there they were, the same horrifying tracks he'd seen at Stoney's camp. Massive, clawed, a chilling mix of animal and something disturbingly manlike. They led from the back door towards the dense thicket of willows and cottonwoods that lined the creek. Alongside them, heartbreakingly small, were the faint scuffs of a child's bare feet, dragged. "Organize a search party!" Wyatt roared to the men gathering outside. "Every man with a rifle and a lantern, spread out along the creek. Check every bush, every shadow." The night descended fully, as the townsmen, their faces grim and set, fanned out, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sending jolts of fear through the searchers. The howls began again, closer this time, seeming to mock their efforts, echoing from the dark hills that loomed over Redemption. Hours passed. The search yielded nothing but more fear and frustration. Little Rosie Henderson was gone, vanished as if swallowed by the night itself. Near the creek bank, in a patch of soft mud, Wyatt found another piece of evidence that made his blood run cold. A small, tattered piece of blue calico fabric, identical to the dress Martha Henderson had said Rosie was wearing. It was snagged on a thorny bush, and beside it another of those monstrous prints pressed deep into the earth. As the exhausted and disheartened search party began to straggle back towards town in the pre-dawn gloom, a figure emerged from the shadows near the marshal's office. It was an old man, his face a mask of wrinkles, his eyes dark and knowing. He was known only as Old Man Willow, a reclusive Yavapai elder who lived alone in a small wickiup a few miles from town, rarely venturing in. He was usually ignored, considered a relic of a bygone era. But tonight his presence felt significant. He approached Wyatt, his movements slow but deliberate. "The moon is growing, Marshal," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The hunger grows with it." Wyatt, bone-weary and heartsick, looked at him. "What do you know about this, old man?" Old Man Willow's gaze was unwavering. "I have seen the signs before, long ago. My grandfather spoke of it. The skinwalker, the man-wolf. It comes when the balance is broken, when greed or violence taints the land." He gestured towards the hills. "It is a creature of shadow and moonlight, a hunter of men, and it will not stop until it is sated or destroyed." Wyatt, a man of logic, of bullets and hard facts, felt a chill deeper than the night air. Skinwalker, man-wolf. The words sounded like something out of a dime novel, a campfire tale meant to scare children. Yet the evidence he had seen with his own eyes, the impossible tracks, the savage force, the intelligent malevolence, it all pointed to something far beyond his experience. He looked up at the sky. The moon, a few days past new, was a sharp silver crescent, already beginning to cast a brighter, colder light upon the terrified town. The hunger grows with it. Old Man Willow's words echoed in his mind, a grim prophecy. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that redemption's nightmare was only just beginning. The sun rose on a town paralyzed by fear. The disappearance of little Rosie Henderson, following so closely on the brutal death of Stony McGee, had stripped away any lingering pretense of rational explanation. No ordinary beast, no matter how savage, spirited away children from their homes. Redemption was no longer just a dusty frontier town. It was a hunting ground. Shops remained shuttered, doors were bolted from the inside, and the usually bustling main street was eerily deserted, save for the occasional armed man hurrying from one building to another, his eyes darting nervously towards the shadows. Wyatt Earp hadn't slept. The image of those monstrous tracks, the sound of Martha Henderson's anguished cries, and Old Man Willow's chilling words about the man-wolf replayed endlessly in his mind. He sat in his office, the door open to the silent street, a shotgun leaning against his desk. Doc Holliday found him there, looking even paler and more drawn than usual, but with a strange, feverish intensity in his eyes. "So," Doc began, forgoing his usual preamble, "the old Yavapai believes we're dealing with something that goes bump in the night, with a particular taste for human flesh and an aversion to polite society." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Skinwalker," he called it. "A man-wolf. He said it's tied to the moon." "Lycanthropy," Doc murmured almost to himself. "An ancient affliction. Tales of it stretch back centuries, across cultures. Always the moon, always the savagery." He coughed a racking sound, then met Wyatt's gaze. "And usually, always a weakness." "Silver," Wyatt said, remembering a fragment from Old Man Willow's cryptic pronouncements. He said only silver could truly harm it. Doc's eyebrows rose. Silver! The purifier! Interesting! Makes a twisted sort of sense if one is to believe in such entities. He tapped his chin thoughtfully. The question then becomes, Wyatt, where does a town like Redemption, which mostly deals in lead, whiskey and regret, find enough silver to arm ourselves against a mythical beast? That was the crux of the problem. Silver coins were scarce, used more for trade with larger towns than for daily transactions. Wyatt pushed himself to his feet. We find it. We beg, borrow, or melt down every piece of silver in this town if we have to. There's no other choice. Their first stop was the assayer's office. Old Man Hemlock, a man whose hands were permanently stained with chemical residue, listened to Wyatt's grim request with skepticism that slowly morphed into dawning horror as Wyatt recounted the evidence. Hemlock had little actual silver bullion, but he did have a small collection of silver ore samples and a few Mexican silver dollars he'd kept as curiosities. "It ain't much, Marshal," he said, his voice quavering slightly as he handed over the meager stash. "But it's pure." Next, they appealed to the townsfolk. Wyatt, with Doc at his side, went door to door, his presence and quiet authority enough to get most people to listen, even through their fear. He didn't try to soften the truth. He told them what they were facing, what Old Man Willow had said, and what they needed. The response was a mixture of terror, disbelief, and a desperate, dawning hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to fight this thing. Women hesitantly offered up cherished silver lockets, thin wedding bands, ornate hair combs passed down through generations. Men rummaged through dusty boxes, producing tarnished silver spoons, an occasional belt buckle, even a few prized silver inlaid spurs. The preacher, his face grim, contributed the church's small silver collection plate. Each offering, no matter how small, was accepted with a solemn gratitude. The growing pile of disparate silver objects on the table in the marshal's office became a symbol of Redemption's collective will to survive. The blacksmith, a burly, quiet man named Gus, whose hands were as skilled with delicate work as they were with heavy iron, was tasked with the crucial job of melting down the silver and attempting to cast bullets. His forge glowed hot throughout the day, the rhythmic clang of his hammer an oddly reassuring sound amidst the oppressive silence of the town. Deputy Hank Ketchum, his initial terror now replaced by a grim determination, assisted him, his young face smudged with soot. Old Man Willow appeared periodically, offering quiet advice on the purity needed, the right heat for the crucible, his ancient knowledge proving surprisingly practical. Doc Holliday, despite his worsening cough, supervised the sorting of the silver, his keen eyes discerning the true metal from plated imitations. He even produced a small, intricately carved silver flask from his own coat pocket. "A gift from a grateful patient in Santa Fe," he said with a wry smile. "Thought it might bring me luck. Perhaps its luck is better served in a different form." As evening approached, casting long, menacing shadows once more, they had a small but precious mound of newly cast silver bullets. They were imperfect, some misshapen, but they were undeniably silver. Wyatt distributed them carefully among himself, Doc, Hank, and the few other townsmen he trusted to keep a cool head and a steady hand, Jebediah Smith and Tom Olson among them. Each man received only a handful. There weren't enough for widespread distribution, not yet. "These have to count," Wyatt said, his voice low and serious as he handed Doc a precious few rounds. "We can't afford to waste a single shot." Doc nodded, carefully loading the silver bullets into his Colt. "Let's hope the legends are true, Wyatt, because if they're not—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The moon, a little fatter than the night before, began its ascent into the inky sky. A palpable tension gripped Redemption. Every man with a silver bullet clutched his weapon tighter. They knew the beast would hunt again tonight. They knew it was out there in the shadows, waiting. And this time, they intended to hunt it back. The small, flickering lights of their lanterns seemed a pitiful defense against the vast, encroaching darkness. But in the glint of silver, there was a sliver of hope, a desperate prayer that their hastily gathered magic would be enough. The air in Redemption was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every shadow seemed to pulse with unseen menace. Every creak of a board or rustle of wind sounded like the approach of the beast. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Deputy Hank Ketchum, and the grim-faced Jebediah Smith and Tom Olson formed the core of the hunting party. Each man clutched a rifle or a six-shooter loaded with the precious, imperfectly formed silver bullets. Old Man Willow had refused to join them directly, stating his role was guidance, not combat. But he'd offered a final, chilling piece of advice. It will be drawn to suffering, to fear, and it will be strongest where it has spilled blood before. That led them to the Henderson cabin at the edge of town. Martha Henderson had been moved, along with her remaining children, to the relative safety of the church. But the small, dilapidated structure still radiated an aura of profound violation and sorrow. It was here, near the scene of little Rosie's abduction, that they decided to make their stand. They didn't have enough men or resources for an elaborate trap. Their plan was simple, desperate. Use a tethered goat, borrowed from a reluctant farmer, as bait, and lie in wait in the deepest shadows surrounding the cabin. The moon, now a significant crescent, cast a stark, silvery light, illuminating open spaces, but leaving pools of impenetrable blackness beneath the cottonwoods and within the derelict outbuildings nearby. Wyatt positioned himself in the crumbling remains of a small woodshed, offering a clear line of sight to the bait and the back of the Henderson cabin. Doc, coughing softly, settled into the deep shadow of a large oak tree, his eyes glittering with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, almost clinical excitement. Hank, Jebediah, and Tom found similar concealed positions, their breathing shallow, their senses strained to the breaking point. Hours crawled by. The only sounds were the nervous bleating of the goat, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl, each noise magnified in the suffocating tension. Wyatt remained perfectly still, his gaze sweeping the area, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. He fought against the weariness that pulled at him, against the insidious whispers of doubt. What if the silver didn't work? What if this creature was beyond anything even Old Man Willow understood? Then the goat fell silent. Not a sudden panicked silence, but an abrupt cessation of sound, as if a hand had clamped over its muzzle. Wyatt's heart leapt. He slowly raised his rifle, peering through the gloom. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the creek bed, moving with an unnatural, fluid speed that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. It was huge, far larger than any wolf, its form hunched and powerful. As it stepped into a patch of moonlight, Wyatt got his first clear, though fleeting look. Matted, dark fur covered a massively muscled frame. Its head was wolf-like, with a long snout and pointed ears. But its eyes, they glowed with that same malevolent yellowish-green light he'd seen in his brief, horrifying glimpse at Stony McGee's camp. And it moved with a chilling, almost bipedal gait before dropping to all fours as it approached the now frozen goat. "Now?" Hank whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in Wyatt's own ears. "Wait for my shot," Wyatt breathed back, his voice tight. He needed it closer, needed to be sure of his aim with the precious silver. The creature reached the goat. Instead of an immediate savage attack, it paused, its great head turning slowly, sniffing the air, its glowing eyes scanning the shadows around the cabin. It knew, it sensed them. Then, with a speed that belied its bulk, it lunged, but not at the goat. It spun, incredibly fast, and charged directly towards the old oak tree where Doc Holliday was concealed. "Doc!" Wyatt roared, simultaneously firing his rifle. The silver bullet struck the creature's shoulder with a sound like a hammer hitting wet leather. It let out an unearthly howl, a sound of pure agony and rage, and stumbled, but didn't go down. Doc, reacting with astonishing speed for a man so frail, fired his own Colt. One of his silver bullets tore into the creature's flank. It shrieked again, a sound that clawed at the nerves, and swatted blindly, one massive clawed paw catching Doc a glancing blow on the arm, sending his pistol flying. The night exploded into chaos. Hank, Jebediah, and Tom opened fire, their shots sporadic in the confusing melee of shadows and moonlight. The werewolf, wounded and enraged, spun, a whirlwind of fur and claws, snapping its terrible jaws. It moved with blinding speed, shrugging off wounds that would have crippled any normal animal. Wyatt saw one of Tom Olson's shots hit it square in the chest, yet it barely faltered. It lunged at Jebediah, who screamed as razor-sharp claws raked across his leg, tearing through his thick trousers and flesh. The old townsman went down, clutching his bleeding limb. Wyatt fired again, aiming for the head, but the creature was a blur of motion. His bullet missed, thudding harmlessly into the dirt. He saw Hank, his face a mask of terror, but his hands surprisingly steady, take careful aim and fire. The werewolf flinched as Hank's bullet struck its side. It seemed to hesitate then, its glowing eyes darting between its attackers, its rasping breath visible as plumes in the cool night air. It was hurt, bleeding from several wounds that smoked faintly where the silver had touched it. But it was far from defeated. With another furious, frustrated howl, it turned and bounded away, disappearing into the dense thicket along the creek with astonishing speed, leaving behind the scent of singed fur, blood, and an overwhelming aura of primal terror. Silence descended, broken only by Jebediah's groans of pain and Doc's ragged coughing as he retrieved his pistol, his face pale, but his eyes blazing. Did we get it?" Hank stammered, reloading his rifle with trembling hands. Wyatt shook his head, his gaze fixed on the dark thicket where the beast had vanished. "We hurt it, but it's not dead." He hurried to Jebediah's side. The gash on his leg was deep, bleeding profusely. Tom Olson was already trying to staunch the flow with a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. "It's fast," Doc rasped, clutching his injured arm. "And damned hard to kill." He looked at the dark stains on the ground where the creature had bled. But the silver, it definitely doesn't like the silver. They had survived their first direct encounter, but the cost was evident. Jebediah was badly wounded, their precious supply of silver bullets was diminished, and the beast was still out there, wounded and undoubtedly enraged. As they carefully helped Jebediah back towards the relative safety of the town, Wyatt knew this was far from over. They had drawn first blood, yes, but they had also felt the terrible, unyielding strength of their adversary. And the moon was still waxing. The first grey light of dawn found redemption. A town teetering on the brink of mass hysteria. News of the night's battle, the terrifying appearance of the man-wolf, Jebediah Smith's gruesome injury, and the creature's escape had spread like a fever through the terrified populace. What little courage had been kindled by the forging of the silver bullets now flickered precariously, threatened by the chilling reality of what they faced. Wyatt Earp, his face etched with exhaustion and a grim resolve, stood in Doc Holliday's small, cluttered room above the Red Garter Saloon. Doc, stripped to his undershirt, was carefully bandaging his own clawed arm, while simultaneously directing Wyatt on how to best tend to Jebediah's mauled leg. The older man was pale and sweating, but conscious. His teeth gritted against the searing pain as Wyatt cleaned the deep, ragged wounds. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp tang of carbolic acid. "It's deep," Wyatt said, his voice low. "The claws tore right through to the muscle. He's lucky it missed the artery." "Luck," Doc rasped, wincing as he tightened the bandage on his own arm. A commodity in short supply in redemption these days, it seems. He coughed a harsh, wet sound. "The silver cauterized where it struck the beast, you saw that? Smoked like brimstone. But these are just tearing wounds. They'll fester if we're not careful." Outside, the mood of the town was deteriorating rapidly. Small, angry knots of men gathered on street corners, their voices low and muttering at first, then rising in volume and agitation. Some demanded Wyatt do more, form a larger posse, hunt the beast down in daylight. Others, their faces white with fear, spoke of abandoning redemption altogether, of fleeing before the man-wolf returned to claim more victims. Storefronts remained boarded up, windows dark and shuttered. The silence that hung over Main Street was no longer one of uneasy quiet, but of profound, suffocating dread. When Wyatt finally emerged from Doc's rooms, his clothes stained with Jebediah's blood, he was met by a delegation of townsmen, their faces a mixture of fear and accusation. Their spokesman was Silas Blackwood, the owner of the general store, a man whose usual bluster was now edged with panic. "Marshal Earp!" Blackwood exclaimed, his voice a little too loud. "What are you going to do? This thing is picking us off one by one. Stoney, then little Rosie, now Jebediah. Who's next? Our children, our wives." Wyatt met his gaze, his own eyes weary but steady. "We fought it, Mr. Blackwood. We wounded it. The silver works." "Wounded it?" another man scoffed. "It got away, didn't it? And Jebediah's half dead. We need to hunt it down now, in the daylight. Kill it in its lair." "And where do you suppose its lair is?" Wyatt asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It could be anywhere in those hills. We go blundering in there. We're walking into its territory, playing its game. We lost the element of surprise last night. It knows we're hunting it. It knows about the silver." He saw the fear in their eyes, the desperate need for action, any action, but he also knew the folly of a reckless, panicked pursuit. They were outmatched in terms of raw strength and cunning in the beast's chosen terrain. Their only advantage was the silver, and their dwindling supply of it. Later that day, as Wyatt, Doc, and Hank Ketchum analyzed the previous night's encounter in the marshal's office, a disturbing detail began to emerge. Hank, still visibly shaken but trying to maintain a brave front, recalled something he'd seen in the chaotic fight, something he'd initially dismissed. "Marshal, when it first attacked Doc, I saw something," Hank said hesitantly. "When it lunged and the moonlight hit its fur, just for a second I thought I saw a piece of cloth, dark cloth tangled in the fur on its chest, like a scrap from a shirt." Wyatt and Doc exchanged a look. "A piece of cloth?" Wyatt pressed. "Are you sure?" Hank nodded. "Pretty sure, sir. It was gone in an instant, but it looked familiar somehow, like something someone in town might wear." A new, insidious layer of dread began to settle over Wyatt. A skinwalker, Old Man Willow had called it. A man-wolf. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a mindless beast. It was, or had been, human. Could it be one of them? Someone from Redemption, transformed by some unholy curse into this nocturnal terror? The thought was almost too monstrous to contemplate. It would explain the creature's cunning, its ability to anticipate their moves, its knowledge of the town's layout. The paranoia, already festering, began to spread through Wyatt's own mind. He found himself looking at familiar faces with a new, unsettling suspicion. Who among them harbored such a dark secret? Who disappeared during the nights? Who bore unexplained scratches or seemed unusually agitated? Doc, ever the pragmatist despite the supernatural circumstances, voiced the thought. "If it is indeed one of us, Wyatt, then it walks among us by day, unsuspecting, or perhaps fully aware." He coughed again, a deep, rattling sound. "That makes our task infinitely more complicated, and infinitely more dangerous." The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in bloody hues of red and orange. The shadows lengthened, and with them the fear in Redemption deepened. The townsfolk retreated behind their locked doors earlier than ever. The silence of the streets punctuated only by the mournful howl of a distant dog and the rhythmic, ominous creak of the saloon sign swinging in the rising wind. Wyatt knew that nightfall would bring not only the threat of the man-wolf, but also the corrosive suspicion that the monster they hunted might be wearing a familiar face by the light of day. The town was on edge, and so was he. The days that followed the first hunt were a torment of waiting. Each sunset brought a fresh wave of terror, each sunrise a temporary, fragile reprieve. The man-wolf did not strike again immediately, but its presence was a palpable weight on Redemption. Perhaps it was healing from the silver wounds, or perhaps it was biding its time, growing stronger as the moon swelled towards fullness. The uncertainty was almost worse than an outright attack. Jebediah Smith lay delirious with fever in Doc Holliday's care, his wounded leg grotesquely swollen and inflamed. Doc, his own strength visibly waning, his cough now a constant racking affliction, tended to him tirelessly, his supply of laudanum dwindling. The town's meagre stockpile of silver bullets was precariously low. Wyatt knew they couldn't afford another prolonged battle of attrition. Their next encounter had to be decisive. The suspicion that the man-wolf was one of Redemption's own citizens had taken root, poisoning the already strained atmosphere. Neighbours eyed each other with distrust. Old grudges resurfaced, cloaked in newfound accusations. Wyatt found himself observing everyone, looking for any sign, any telltale mark. But the beast, if it walked among them by day, was a master of concealment. One evening, as the moon hung like a malevolent silver disk in the darkening sky, almost full, Wyatt gathered Doc and a grim-faced Hank Ketchum in the marshal's office. The air was heavy with unspoken fear. "We can't just wait for it to pick us off," Wyatt said, his voice low and strained. "It's getting stronger. Jebediah, he's not doing well. We need to end this tonight." Doc nodded slowly, his eyes unnaturally bright in his gaunt face. "Our options are limited, Wyatt. We're low on silver, low on men willing to face it again after what happened to Jebediah. A direct confrontation in the open, it's too risky." "So we don't fight it in the open," Wyatt said, a desperate plan forming in his mind. "We lure it somewhere confined, somewhere we can control the engagement." He looked at a crude map of the town and its surroundings spread on his desk. His finger tapped on a spot just outside of town, the old abandoned Redemption silver mine. The main shaft. It's deep, narrow in places. If we could get it in there. Hank swallowed hard. "Lure it, Marshal. How? And who's going to be the bait?" The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Wyatt met their gazes. "I will." Doc started to protest, a coughing fit seizing him. But Wyatt raised a hand. "It's the only way. It seems to have a particular interest in those who've harmed it, or those who lead the opposition." He managed a grim smile. "That puts me at the top of its list." The plan was desperate, bordering on suicidal. Wyatt would make himself a visible target near the mine entrance. Doc and Hank, armed with the last of the silver bullets, and strategically placed dynamite charges filched from the mining office, a relic from Redemption's more optimistic early days, would be hidden nearby, ready to trigger a cave-in to trap the beast if Wyatt could draw it deep enough into the main tunnel. As night fell, a heavy, oppressive silence blanketed Redemption. The moon, nearly full, bathed the landscape in an eerie, spectral glow. Wyatt rode out alone towards the abandoned mine, the weight of his colt loaded with precious silver, a cold comfort against his hip. He felt the eyes of the town on his back, a mixture of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. He dismounted near the gaping, shadowed maw of the mine entrance, the air emanating from it cold and smelling of damp earth and decay. He built a small fire, its light a beacon in the vast darkness, and waited. The silence was absolute, unnatural. Even the crickets seemed to have fallen silent. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher, casting long skeletal shadows. Doubt began to gnaw at Wyatt. Had he miscalculated? Was the beast too cunning for such a straightforward trap? He thought of Stoney, of little Rosie, of Jebediah lying near death. He thought of the terror that held Redemption hostage. Failure was not an option. Then he heard it. A faint rustle in the undergrowth. A twig snapping. His hand instinctively went to his gun. He strained his eyes, peering into the moon-drenched landscape. A massive dark shape emerged from the trees, moving with that terrifying fluid grace. The man-wolf, its eyes like twin embers fixed on him. It was larger than he remembered, its fur bristling, its lips curled back in a silent snarl, revealing rows of glistening fangs. Wyatt stood his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Come on, then," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "You want me? Come and get me." The beast let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated in Wyatt's chest. It began to advance, slowly, deliberately, as if savouring the moment. Wyatt backed away slowly, towards the mine entrance. "That's it. Come on." The man-wolf broke into a run, covering the ground with incredible speed. Wyatt turned and sprinted into the black, gaping mouth of the mine tunnel, the creature's hot, fetid breath close behind him. He plunged into the oppressive darkness, stumbling over loose rocks and debris, his lantern casting a wildly dancing circle of light. He could hear the beast scrabbling behind him, its heavy claws echoing in the confined space. He ran deeper, further into the earth, the air growing colder, staler. He risked a glance back. The glowing eyes were there, gaining on him. Suddenly, his foot caught on an old rotten timber. He went down hard, his lantern skittering away, plunging him into near total darkness. Pain shot through his ankle. He scrambled, trying to push himself up, but a massive weight slammed into his back, driving the air from his lungs. Razor-sharp claws tore at his shoulder, ripping through his thick coat and shirt. He cried out, a raw sound of pain and desperation. The man-wolf was on him, its hot breath on his neck, its monstrous jaws snapping inches from his face. He could smell its foul carrion scent. This was it. All is lost. He had failed. Redemption was doomed. In the suffocating darkness, pinned beneath the monstrous weight, with the creature's death snarls echoing in his ears, Wyatt Earp closed his eyes. A single stark thought flashing through his mind. Not like this. Pinned beneath the crushing weight of the man-wolf, the suffocating darkness of the mine pressing in, Wyatt Earp fought against the black tide of despair. The beast's hot, fetid breath washed over his face, its guttural snarls vibrating through his very bones. Razor claws dug into his shoulder, sending bolts of agony through him. He could feel its immense power, the feral rage that fueled it. This was no mere animal. This was a force of pure, concentrated malice. But even as the monstrous jaws snapped perilously close to his throat, a primal instinct for survival, honed over years of facing death, surged through Wyatt. He wasn't a legend for nothing. With a desperate, explosive effort, he twisted his body, ignoring the searing pain in his ankle and shoulder. He managed to get one arm partially free, his fingers scrabbling in the loose dirt and rock of the mine floor. His hand closed around something hard and cool, a loose, heavy rock, dislodged in his fall. With a roar born of desperation and fury, Wyatt slammed the rock with all his might against the side of the man-wolf's head. There was a sickening thud, and the creature let out a yelp of surprised pain, its grip momentarily loosening. It was a small reprieve, but it was enough. Wyatt shoved, bucked and rolled, scrambling out from under the beast's oppressive weight. He scrabbled wildly for his dropped colt, his fingers brushing against its familiar cold steel just as the man-wolf, shaking its massive head, lunged again. He didn't have time to aim. He just pointed and fired. The roar of the peacemaker in the confined space was deafening, the flash of the muzzle momentarily illuminating the monstrous, snarling visage of his attacker. The silver bullet struck the beast high on its chest. It howled, a sound of pure agony this time, and recoiled, clutching at the wound, which smoked and sizzled where the silver had struck. Wyatt scrambled to his feet, his injured ankle protesting fiercely. He backed away deeper into the tunnel, firing again. Another silver bullet hit the creature in the leg, making it stumble. But it was far from finished, its glowing eyes now blazing with an even more intense, hateful light fixed on him. It was wounded, enraged, and cornered. "Doc! Hank! Now!" Wyatt bellowed, his voice hoarse, hoping they could hear him above the din. The man-wolf, ignoring its wounds, charged again, a terrifying avalanche of fur and claws. Wyatt fired his last silver bullet, the shot going wide in his haste as he stumbled backward over a loose sleeper from the old mine track. He was out of silver. He braced himself for the impact, fumbling for his knife, a pitiful defense against such a creature. But just as the beast was almost upon him, a deafening explosion rocked the mine from further up the tunnel near the entrance. The ground trembled and rocks and dust rained down from the ceiling. The man-wolf skidded to a halt, momentarily confused, its head swiveling towards the sound of the blast. It was the distraction Wyatt desperately needed. He saw his dropped lantern nearby, still miraculously lit, though its flame was sputtering. In that split second, Doc Holliday appeared at a bend in the tunnel behind the beast, his face a ghostly white in the dim light, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In one hand he held his own Colt, and in the other a sputtering stick of dynamite with a very short fuse. "Catch, you hairy son of a bitch!" Doc rasped, and with a desperate underhand toss he threw the dynamite. It landed almost directly beneath the man-wolf. The creature looked down at the hissing, sparking stick with a flicker of something that might have been animalistic confusion. Wyatt lunged for his lantern, grabbed it, and hurled himself sideways into a shallow alcove just as the dynamite exploded with a colossal, eardrum-shattering roar. The tunnel filled with smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of explosives. The force of the blast threw Wyatt against the rock wall, stunning him. For a moment there was only ringing silence and choking dust. Wyatt pushed himself up, coughing, his ears screaming. He fumbled for matches, relit his miraculously intact lantern with trembling hands. Through the settling dust, he saw Doc leaning against the tunnel wall, gasping for breath, but grinning weakly. Hank Ketchum appeared behind him, his face smudged with soot, looking terrified but triumphant. Did we get it?" Hank stammered. Wyatt raised his lantern, its flickering light cutting through the haze. The section of the tunnel where the man-wolf had stood was a devastation of shattered rock and splintered timbers. And in the midst of it, half buried under a pile of debris, lay the massive, still form of the creature. It was mangled, broken, its fur singed and matted with blood and rock dust. But as Wyatt approached cautiously, his empty Colt held ready, he saw its chest was still. Its malevolent, glowing eyes were dark. Slowly, almost hesitantly, as the dust continued to settle, a subtle change began to occur in the creature's form. The elongated snout seemed to shorten, the coarse fur to recede. The massive clawed paws began to shrink, the limbs to reshape themselves. Wyatt, Doc, and Hank watched in stunned, horrified silence as the monstrous form of the man-wolf slowly, almost grotesquely, transformed. The moonlight, filtering faintly from the now partially collapsed mine entrance, illuminated the final shocking revelation. Lying there, broken and dead amidst the rubble, was not some unidentifiable beast from the depths of nightmare. It was Silas Blackwood, the general store owner, his face frozen in a mask of transformed agony, his fine town clothes now shredded and bloodied, remnants of dark fabric still clinging to what had been the creature's chest. The man who had been so vocal in his fear, so demanding of action, had been the monster all along. A heavy silence filled the mine tunnel, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant drip of water. The terror of the man-wolf was finally over, but a new, more insidious horror, the horror of betrayal, of a monster hidden in plain sight, settled over them. Wyatt looked at the transformed body, then at Doc and Hank. The fight was won. The beast was dead, but the scars, both visible and invisible, would remain with Redemption for a long, long time. The journey back from the collapsed mine shaft was slow and sombre. Wyatt, leaning heavily on Hank Ketchum due to his throbbing ankle, and Doc Holliday, whose every breath seemed a painful effort, supported each other as they emerged into the pale, pre-dawn light. The moon, now beginning its descent, looked faded and weary, its malevolent power spent. They left the body of Silas Blackwood where it lay, entombed in the mine he had, in his monstrous form, so nearly made Wyatt's grave. The truth of his identity was a burden they would carry back to the town, a truth that would shock and forever scar Redemption. As they limped into Main Street, the first tentative rays of sun were painting the dusty storefronts in hues of pale gold. A few brave or desperate souls were already stirring, their faces etched with anxiety as they saw the marshal and his companions returning, battered, bloodied, and coated in grime. Word spread with the speed of a prairie fire. The marshal was back. The beast, was it dead? Wyatt didn't have the strength for a grand announcement. He simply nodded to the gathering crowd, his face grim. "It's over," he said, his voice raspy. "The creature is dead." A collective sigh, a gasp of disbelief and dawning relief rippled through the onlookers. Some women began to weep openly, tears of fear giving way to tears of profound release. Men who had been rigid with tension sagged against walls, their faces slack with exhaustion, and the sudden lifting of an unbearable weight. The full story of Blackwood's horrifying double life and his demise came out slowly, recounted in hushed tones by Wyatt and Doc in the marshal's office to a select few of the town's elders and the grieving Martha Henderson. The shock was profound, disbelief warring with the undeniable relief that the reign of terror was truly at an end. Little Rosie was still gone, a permanent scar on the heart of Redemption. But at least no more children would vanish, no more men would be torn apart by the man-wolf. The city had peace again. A fragile, hard-won peace, but peace nonetheless. Jebediah Smith, Doc Holliday declared after a thorough examination later that morning, would live. His fever had broken slightly with the dawn, and though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his days, the shadow of death had receded. Perhaps, Doc mused wryly, the demise of the creature that had inflicted the wound had some sympathetic effect. That evening, the Red Garter Saloon, usually a place of boisterous revelry or tense standoffs, was different. The piano player, a thin, nervous man named Al, hesitantly began to play, his tunes softer, more melancholic than usual. They celebrated at the bar, listening to lots of music and drinking. But it wasn't the wild, unthinking celebration of a gold strike or a holiday. It was quieter, more subdued, a gathering of survivors. Men and women raised glasses, not in boisterous toasts, but in quiet acknowledgment of what they had all endured. They drank to Stony McGee, to the memory of little Rosie, to Jebediah's resilience. They drank to Wyatt Earp, to Doc Holliday, to young Hank Ketchum, their courage already becoming the stuff of local legend. They drank to the silver bullets, to the desperate gamble in the mine, and to the simple, profound relief of being alive. Wyatt sat at a small table in the corner, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. His ankle was tightly bandaged, his shoulder ached, and exhaustion lay upon him like a physical weight. He watched the townsfolk, the muted laughter, the shared glances, the slow, hesitant return to something resembling normalcy. He saw Martha Henderson sitting quietly with a few other women, a small sad smile on her face as someone offered her a drink. The peace was real, but it was a peace forever coloured by the darkness they had faced. Doc Holliday slid into the chair opposite him, a fresh glass of whiskey in his hand, his breathing still laboured, but a spark of his old fire back in his eyes. "Well, Wyatt," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Another town saved, another monster slain. All in a day's work for the fearless Marshal Earp, eh?" Wyatt managed a faint smile. "Something like that, Doc." He finally picked up his glass. "To redemption," he said quietly. Doc raised his own glass. "To redemption. May its nights remain uneventful, and its general store owners less lycanthropic." They drank, the amber liquid a small warmth against the lingering chill of the nightmare. The music played on, a thread of fragile hope weaving through the saloon. Wyatt looked out the window at the street, now quiet under the first stars of evening. The shadows were just shadows again, for now he knew the story of the man-wolf of redemption would be told and retold, growing with each telling another dark thread in the tapestry of the Old West. But for Wyatt Earp, it was more than a story. It was a reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it, and that sometimes the greatest monsters wore the most familiar faces. As the music swelled, a little brighter now, a little more defiant, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The city had peace again, and for tonight that was enough. Loved Wyatt Earp's battle against the beast. Don't miss the next legend. Smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you're first to see what horrors and heroes we unearth next. Your support brings more stories like this to life.